Hello, this is the Lobster Gamer, and welcome back to what promises to be the final look at the Dunwich Horror by H.P. Lovecraft. We're going to try to finish the entire thing, the remaining chapters in this read-through. I hope you're enjoying this, and I hope you're seeing the similarities and differences with the movies. And as always, check those movies out, check out the other stuff on my channel, and let's get right into it. Chapter 8. In the meantime, a quieter, yet even more spiritually poignant phase of the horror had been blackly unwinding itself behind the closed door of a shelf-lined Rimanacum. The curious manuscript record, a diary of Wilbur Whately, delivered to Miskatonic University for translation, had caused much worry and bafflement among the experts in language both ancient and modern. Its very alphabet, notwithstanding a general resemblance to the heavily shaped Arabic used in Mesopotamia, being absolutely unknown to any available authority. The final conclusion of a linguist was that the text represented an artificial alphabet, given the effect of a cipher, though none of the usual methods of cryptographic solution seemed to furnish any clue, even when applied on the basis of every tongue the writer might conceivably have used. The ancient books taken from Whately's quarters, while absorbingly interesting in several cases, promising to open new and terrible lines of research among philosophers and men of science, were of no assistance whatever in this matter. One of them, a heavy tome with an iron clasp, was in another unknown alphabet, this one in a very different cast, resembling Sanskrit more than anything else. The old ledger was at length given wholly to the charge of Dr. Armitage, both because of his peculiar interest in the Whately matter and because his wide linguistic learning and skill in the mystical formulae of antiquity and the Middle Ages. Armitage had an idea that the alphabet might be something esoterically used by certain forbidden cults which have come down from old times, and which have inherited many forms and traditions from the wizards of the Sarcentic world. That question, however, he did not deem vital, since it would be unnecessary to know the origin of the symbols, as he suspected they were used as a cipher in a modern language. It was his belief that, considering the great amount of text involved, the writer would scarcely have wished the trouble of using another speech than his own, save perhaps in certain special formulae and incantations. Accordingly, he attacked the manuscript with the preliminary assumption that the bulk of it was in English. Dr. Armitage knew from the repeated failures of his colleagues that the riddle was a deep and complex one, and that no simple mode of solution could merit even a trial. All through late August he fortified himself with the mass lore of cryptography, drawing upon the fullest resources of his own library, and waiting night after night amidst the arcana of Trithemius's Polygraphia, Gambistia's Portas de Fuertes Literavis Notis, De Venere's Trate de Chiffre, Falconer's Cryptomensis Patefacta, Davies and Thickness's 18th century treatise, and such fairly modern authorities as Blairvine, Martin, and Kluber's script itself, and in time became convinced that he had to deal with one of those subtlest and most ingenious of cryptograms, in which many separate lists of corresponding letters are arranged like multiplication table, and the message built with arbitrary keywords known only to the initiated. The older authorities seemed rather more helpful than the newer ones, and Armitage concluded that the code of the manuscript was one of great antiquity, no doubt handed down through a long line of mystical experimenters. Several times he seemed near daylight, only to be set back by some unforeseen obstacle. Then, as September approached, the clouds began to clear. Certain letters, as used in certain parts of the manuscript, emerged definitively and unmistakably, and it became obvious the text was indeed in English. On the evening of September 2nd, the last major barrier gave way, and Dr. Armitage read for the first time a continuous passage of Wilbur Whately's annals. It was in truth a diary, as all had thought, and it was couched in a style clearly showing the mixed occult erudition of the general literacy of the strange being who wrote it. Almost the first long passage that Armitage deciphered, an entry dated November 26, 1916, proved highly startling and disquieting. It was written, as he remembered, by a child of 3 and a half, who looked like it had a lad of 12 or 13. Today he learned from Acklow for the Sabbath, it ran, which did not like it being answerable from the hill and not from the air. That upstairs more ahead of me than I had thought it would be, and is not like to have much earth brain. Shoot Elam Hutchins called Jack when he went to bite me, and Elam says he would kill me if he dast. I guess he won't. Grandfather kept me saying that dough formula last night, and I think I saw the inner city at the 2 magnetic poles. I shall go to those poles when the earth is cleared off, if I can't break through with Dohina formula when I commit it. They from the air told me at Sabbath that it will be years before I can clear off the earth, and I guess grandfather will be dead then, so I shall have to learn all the angles of the planes, and all the formulas between the Yerb and the Nigger. They from outside will help, and they cannot take body without human blood. That upstairs looks will have right casp, and I can see it a little when I make the Vorish sign or below the powder of Ibn Ghazi at it. It is near them, when at May Eve on the hill, the other face may wear off some. I wonder how I shall look when the earth is cleared, and there are no earth beings on it. He that came with the Aklo Sabaoth said I may be transfigured, there being much outside to work on. Morning found Dr. Armitage in a cold sweat of terror and frenzy and wailful concentration. He had not left the manuscript all night, but sat at his table under electric light, turning page after page with shaking hands, as fast as he could decipher the cryptic text. He had nervously telephoned his wife he would not be home, and when she brought him breakfast at the house, he could scarcely dispose of a mouthful. All that day he read on, now and then halted maddeningly by a reapplication of the complex key became necessary. Lunch and dinner were brought him, and he ate only the smallest fraction of either. Toward the middle of the next night he dozed off in his chair, but soon woke on a tangle of nightmares almost as hideous as the truths and menaces to man's existence that he had uncovered. On the morning of September 4th, Professor Rice and Dr. Morgan insisted on seeing him for a while, and departed tremblingly with ashen gray. That evening he went to bed and slept only fitfully. Wednesday, the next day, he was back at the manuscript and began to take copious notes both from the current sections and from those he had already deciphered. In the small hours of that night he slept a little in an easy chair in his office, but was at the manuscript again before dawn. Sometime before noon his physician, Dr. Hartwell, called to see him and insisted that he cease work. He refused, intimating that it was of most vital importance for him to complete the reading of the diary, and promised an explanation in due course of time. That evening, just as twilight fell, he finished the terrible perusal and sank back exhausted. His wife, bringing his dinner, found him in half-comatose state, but he was conscious enough to warn her off with a sharp cry when he saw her eyes wander toward the notes he'd taken. Weakly rising, he gathered up the scribbled papers and sealed them all in a great envelope, which he immediately placed inside his coat pocket. He had sufficient strength to get home, but was so clearly in need of medical aid that Dr. Hartwell was summoned at once. As the doctor put him to bed, he could only mutter over and over again, "By what in God's name can we do?" Dr. Armitage slept, but was partly delirious the next day. He made no explanations to Hartwell, and his calmer moments spoke of the impertinent need of a long conference with Rice and Morgan. His wilder wanderings were very startling indeed, including frantic appeals that something in that boarded-up farmhouse be destroyed, and fantastic references to some plan for the extirpation of the entire human race and all animal and vegetable life from the earth by some terrible elder race of beings from another dimension. He would shout that the world was in danger. Such elder things wished to strip it and drag it away from the solar system and cosmos and matter into some other plane or phase of entity from which it had once fallen, vigintillions of aeons ago. At other times he would call for the dreaded Necronomicon and the Deum Indetria of Regimus, in which he seemed hopeful of finding some formula to check the peril he'd conjured up. "Stop them! Stop them!" he would shout. "Those Whateleys meant to let it in, and the worst of all is left. Tell Rice and Morgan we must do something. It is sublime business, and I know how to make the powder. It hasn't been fed since the 2nd of August when Wilbur came here to his death, and at that rate—" But Armitage had found a sound physique despite his 73 years, and slept off his disorder that night without developing any real fever. He woke late Friday clear of head, though sober with a gnawing fear and a tremendous sense of responsibility. Saturday afternoon he felt able to go to the library and summon Rice and Morgan for a conference, and the rest of that day and evening the three men tortured their brains in the wildest speculation and most desperate debate. Strange and terrible books were drawn voluminously from the stack shelves and the secure places of storage, and diagrams and formulae were copied with feverish haste, and in bewildering abundance of skepticism there was none. All three had seen the body of Wilbur Whateley as it lay on the floor in the room in that very building, and after that not one of them could even feel slightly inclined to treat the diary as a madman's raven. Opinions were divided as to notifying the Massachusetts State Police, and the negative finally won. There were simply things involved which could not be believed by those who had not seen a sample, and as indeed was made clear during certain subsequent investigations. Late at night, the conference disbanded without having developed a definite plan, but all day Sunday Armitage was busy comparing formulae and mixing chemicals obtained from the college laboratory. The more he reflected on the hellish diary, the more he inclined to doubt the efficacy of any material agent in stamping out the entity which Wilbur Whately had left behind. The earth-threatening entity, which unknown to him was to burst forth in a few hours and become the memorable Dunwich horror. Monday was a repetition of Sunday with Dr. Armitage, for the task in hand required an infinity of research and experiment. Further consultations of the monstrous diary brought various changes of plan, but he knew that even in the end a large amount of uncertainty must remain. By Tuesday he had a definite line of action mapped out, and believed he would try a trip to Dunwich within a week. Then on Wednesday the great shock came. Tucked obscurely away in a corner of the Arkham Advertiser was a factitious little item from the Associated Press, telling what a record-breaking monster the bootleg whiskey of Dunwich had raised up. Armitage, half stunned, could only telephone for Rice and Morgan. Far into the night they discussed, and the next day was a whirlwind of preparation on the part of all of them. Armitage knew he would be meddling with terrible powers, yet saw that there was no other way to annul the deeper and more malign meddlings which others had done before him. Chapter 9. Friday morning, Armitage, Rice, and Morgan set out by motor for Dunwich, arriving at the village about 1 in the afternoon. The day was pleasant, but even in the brightest sunlight a kind of quiet dread and portent seemed to hover about the strangely domed hills and deep shadowy ravines of the stricken region. Now and then on some mountain top a gaunt circle of stones could be glimpsed against the sky. From the air of hushed fright of Osborne's store they knew that something hideous had happened, and soon learned of the annihilation of Elmer Fry house and family. Throughout that afternoon they rode around Dunwich, questioning the natives concerning all that had occurred, and seeing for themselves at rising pangs of horror the drear Fry ruins, with their lingering traces of a terry stickiness, the blasphemous tracks of the Fry yard, and the wounded Seth Bishop cattle, and the enormous swaths of disturbed vegetation in various places. The trail up and down Sentinel Hill seemed to Armitage an almost cataclysmic significance, and he looked at the sinister altar-like stone in the stomach. At length the visitors, apprised of a party of state police which had come from Aylesbury that morning in response to the first telephone reports on the Fry tragedy, decided to seek out the officers and compare notes as far as practicable. This, however, they found more easily planned than performed, since no sign of the party could be found in any direction. There had been 5 of them in the car, but now the car stood empty near the ruins in the Fry yard. The natives, all of whom had talked with the policeman, seemed at first perplexed as Armitage and his companions. Then old Sam Hutchins thought of something and turned pale, nudging Fred Farr and pointing to the dank, deep hollow that yawned close by. "God," he gasped, "I tell him not to go down in the glen, and I never thought nobody'd do it with them tracks and that smell and the whippoorwills a screeching down there in that dark noonday." A cold shudder ran through the natives and visitors alike, and every ear seemed strained in a kind of instinctive, unconscious listening. Armitage, now that he had actually come upon the horror and its monstrous work, trembled with responsibility he felt to be his. Night would soon fall, and it was then that the monstrous blasphemy lumbered upon its eldritch course. Negodium perambunduens intemeris, the old librarian rehearsed the formula he had memorized, and clutched the paper containing the alternative one he had not memorized. He saw his eclectic flashlight was in working order. Rice beside him took from a valise a metal sprayer of the sort used in combating insects, whilst Morgan uncased a big game rifle on which he relied despite his colleagues' warning that no material weapon would be of help. Armitage, having read the hideous diary, knew painfully well what kind of manifestation to expect, but he did not add to the fright of the Dunwich people by giving any hints or clues. He hoped that it might be conquered without any revelation to the world of the monstrous thing that had escaped. As the shadows gathered, the natives commenced to disperse homeward, anxious to bar themselves indoors despite the present evidence that the human locks and bolts were useless for a force that could bend trees and crush houses when it chose. They shook their heads at the visitors' plan to stand guard at the Fry ruins near the glen, and as they left, in little expectancy of seeing the watchers again. There were rumblings under the hills that night, and the whippoorwills piped threateningly. Once in a while a wind swept out of Cold Spring Glen would bring a touch of ineffable fear to the heavy night air, such a fetor as all 3 of the watchers had smelled once before, when they stood above the dying thing that had passed 15 years and a half as a human being. But the look for terror did not appear. Whatever was down there in the glen was biding its time, and Armitage told his colleagues it would be suicidal to try to attack it in the dark. Morning came wanly, and the night sound ceased. It was a grey, bleak day, with now then a drizzle of rain, and the heavier and heavier clouds seemed to be piling themselves up beyond the hills to the northwest. The men from Arkham were undecided what to do. Seeking shelter from the increasing rainfall beneath one of the few undestroyed Fry outbuildings, they debated the wisdom of waiting, and of taking the aggressive, and going and down to the glen in quest of the nameless monstrous quarry. The downpour waxed in heaviness, and the distant peals of thunder sounded from far horizons. Sheet lightning stammered, and the forky bolt flashed near at hand as if descending into the accursed glen itself. The sky grew very dark, and the watchers hoped the storm would prove a short, sharp one, followed by clear weather. It was still gruesomely dark when, not much over an hour later, a confused babble of voices sounded down the road. Another moment brought to view a frightened group of more than a dozen men running and shouting, even whimpering hysterically. Someone in the lead began sobbing out words, and the Arkham men started violently when those words developed a coherent form. "Oh, my God, the voice choked out. "It's a-going again, and this time by day. It's out and moving this very minute, and only the Lord knows when it'll all be on us." The speaker panted into silence, and then another took up his message. "9 an hour ago, Zeb Whately here heard the phone ringing, and it was Miss Cora George's wife that lives down by the junction. She said the hired boy Luther was out driving the cows in the storm after the big boat, when he sees all the trees abandoned in the mouth of the glen opposite their side of this, and smelt the same awful smell like he smelt when he found the big tracks last Monday morning. And he says they was a swishing and a lapping sound, not more nor than the bending trees and bushes could make. And all in this suddenness the trees along the road began to get pushed to one side, and they was awful stomping and splashing in the mud. But mind you, Luther, he didn't see nothing at all, only just bending trees and underbrush. Then fur ahead where Bishop's Brook goes under the road, he heard an awful creaking and straining on the bridge, and he says he could tell the sound of wood starting to crack and split. And all the whiles he never see a thing, only them trees and bushes a bending. And all the while slishing sound got very fur off on the road toward Wizard Whately's and Sentinel Hill. Luther, he had the guts to step up where he heard it first and look at the ground. It was all mud and water, and the sky was dark, and the rain was wiping out all the tracks about as fast as can be. But beginning the glen mouth where the trees had moved, there was still some of them awful prints as big as bars like he seen Monday. At this point, the first excited speaker interrupted. "But that ain't the trouble now. That was only the start. Zeb here was calling folks up, and everybody was listening, and then a call from Seth Bishop's cut in. His housekeeper, Sally, was carrying on for fit to kill. She just see the trees abandoned in the road, and says they kind of mushy sound like an elephant puffing and treading, and heading for the house. And then she spoke up, sudden and fearful smell, and says her boy Chance was a-screaming and how it was just like when he smelled up a Whately remains Monday morning, and the dogs was barking and whining awful. And then she let out a terrible yell and said the shed down the road had just caved in like the storm bed blowed it over, only the wind wasn't strong enough to do that. Everybody was listening, and we could hear lots of folks on the wire gasping. All on Sally said she yelled again, and says the front yard and the picket fence had crumbled up. There was no sign of what done it, and then everybody on the line could hear Chancey and old Seth Bishop yelling, too, and Sally is shrieking, and something heavy had struck the house. No lightning, no nothing, but something heavy again in front that kept launching itself again and again, though you couldn't see nothing in the front windows, and then... Lines of fright deepened on every face, and Armitage, shaken as he was, barely poised enough to prompt the speaker. And then Sally, she yelled out, "Oh, help! The house is a-caving in!" And on the wire we could hear terrible crashing and a whole flock screaming, and just like when Elmer Fry's place was took, only worse. The man paused, and another of the crowd spoke. "That's all. Not a sound nor a squeak over the phone out of that. Just still like. We'd have heard it. Got out of Fords and wagons and rounded up as many able-bodied men folks as we could get at Cora's place, and come up here to see what you thought best to do. Now best what I think is the Lord's judgment for our iniquities that no mortal can ever set aside." Armitage saw that the time for positive action had come and spoke decisively to the faltering group of frightened rustics. "We must follow it, boys." He made his voice as reassuring as possible. "I believe there's a chance of putting it out of business. You men know that those Whateleys were wizards.
Now, this thing is a thing of wizardry, and must be put down by the same means. I've seen Wilbur Whately's diary, and read some of the strange old books he used to read. When I think I know the right kind of spell to recite to make the thing fade away, of course one can't be sure, but we can always take a chance. It's invisible, I knew it would be, but there's a powder in this long-distance sprayer that might make it show up for a second. Later on we'll try it. It's a frightful thing to have alive, but it isn't as bad as what Wilbur would have let in if he'd lived longer. You'll never know what the world escaped. Now we've only this one thing to fight, and it can't multiply. It can, though, do a lot of harm, so we mustn't hesitate to rid the community of it. We must follow it, and the way to begin is to go to the place that has been wrecked. Somebody lead the way. I don't know your roads very well, but I've an idea there might be a shorter cut across lots. How about it?
The men shuffled about a moment. Then Earl Sawyer spoke, softly, pointing with a grimy finger through the steadily lessening rain. I guess you can get to South Bishop's as quick by cutting across the lower meadow here, wading the brook at the low place and climbing through the carrier's meadow and a timber lot beyond. That comes out on the upper road mighty nice, yes. A little the other side. Armitage, with Rice and Morgan, started to walk in the direction indicated, and most of the natives followed slowly. The sky was growing lighter, and there were signs that the storm had worn itself away. When Armitage inadvertently took the wrong direction, Joe Osborne warned him and walked ahead to show the right one. Courage and confidence were mounting, though the twilight of the almost perpendicular wooded hill which lay toward the end of the shortcut, and almost whose fantastic ancient trees they had to scramble as if up a ladder, put these qualities to a severe test. At length they emerged on a muddy road to find the sun coming out. They were a little beyond the Seth Bishop place, but bent trees and hideously unmistakable tracks showed what had passed by. Only a few moments were consumed in surveying the ruins just beyond round the bend. It was the Fry incident all over again, and nothing dead or living was found in either the collapsed shells which had been the Bishop house and barn. No one cared to remain there amidst the stench and terry stickiness, but all turned instinctively to the line of horrible prints leading on toward the wrecked Whately farmhouse and the altar-crowned slopes of Sentinel Hill. As the men passed the sight of Wilbur Whately's abode, they shuddered visibly, and seemed again to mix hesitancy with their zeal. It was no joke tracking down something as big as a house that no one could see, but it had all the vicious malevolence of a demon. Opposite the base of Sentinel Hill, the tracks left the road, and there was a fresh bending and matting visible along the broad swath marking the monster's former route to and from the summit. Armitage produced a pocket telescope of considerable power and scanned the steep green side of the hill. Then he handed the instrument to Morgan, whose sight was keener. After a moment of gazing, Morgan cried out sharply, passing the glass to Earl Sawyer and indicating a certain spot in the slope with his finger. Sawyer, as clumsy as most non-users of optical devices are, fumbled a while, but evidently focused on the lens with Armitage's aid. When he did so, his cry was less restrained than Morgan's had been. God almighty, the grass and bushes are moving, and it's going up slow-like, creeping up to the top this minute. Heaven only knows what for. Then the germ of panic seemed to spread among the seekers. It was one thing to chase the nameless entity, but quite another to find it. Spells might be all right, but suppose they weren't. Voices began questioning Armitage about what he knew of the thing, and no reply seemed quite to satisfy. Everyone seemed to feel himself in close proximity to phases of nature and being utterly forbidden and wholly outside the sane experience of mankind. Chapter 10. In the end, the three men from Arkham, old white-bearded Dr. Armitage, stocky iron-gray Professor Rice, and lean, youngish Dr. Morgan, ascended the mountain alone. After much patient instruction regarding its focusing and use, they left the telescope with the frightened group and remained in the road. And as they climbed, they were watched closely by those among whom the glass had passed round. It was hard going, and Armitage had to be helped more than once. High above the toiling group, the great swath trembled as if its hellish maker repassed with snail-like deliberateness, and it was obvious that the pursuers were gaining. Curtis Whately, of the Undecayed branch, was holding the telescope when Arkham party detoured radically from the swath. He told the crowd that the men were evidently trying to get to a subordinate peak which overlooked the swath at a point, considerably ahead of where the shrubbery was now bending. This indeed proved to be true, and the party was seen to gain minor elevation only a short time after the invisible blasphemy had passed it. Then Wesley Corey, who had taken the glass, cried out that Armitage was adjusting the sprayer which Rice held, and that something must be about to happen. The crowd stood uneasily, recalling his sprayer was expected to give the unseen horror a moment of visibility. 2 or 3 men shut their eyes, but Curtis Whately snatched back the telescope and strained his vision to the utmost. He saw that Rice, from the party's point of advantage above and beyond the entity, had an excellent chance to spread the potent powder with marvelous effect. Those without the telescope saw only an instant's flash of gray cloud, a cloud about the size of a moderately large building, near the top of the mountain. Curtis, who held the instrument, dropped it with a piercing shriek in the ankle-deep mud of the road. He reeled and would have crumbled to the ground had not 2 or 3 of the others seized and steadied him. All he could do was moan half inaudibly, "Oh, great God, that!" There was pandemonium of questioning, and only Henry Wheeler thought to rescue the fallen telescope and wipe it clean of mud. Curtis was past all coherence, and even isolated replies were too much for him. "Beggar in the barn, all made in squirming ropes, whole thing sort of shaped like a hen's egg, bigger than anything with dozens of legs, and like a hog's head that half shut up when they step, nothing solid about it. It's all like jelly and made of separate wriggling ropes pushed close together, great bulging eyes all over, 10 or 20 miles, and trunks are sticking out all over the sides, big as stovepipes, and all tossing and opening and shutting, and all gray with a kinder blue or purple rings, all God in heaven, and that half face on top." This final memory, or whatever it was, proved far too much for poor Curtis, and he collapsed completely before he could say more. Fred Farr and Will Hutchins carried him to the roadside and laid him on the damp grass. Henry Wheeler, trembling, turned to rescue telescope on the mountain to see what he might. Through the lenses were discernible 3 tiny fingers, apparently running towards the summit as fast as the steep incline allowed. Only these, nothing more. Then everyone noticed a strangely unreasonable noise in the deep valley behind, and even in the underbrush of Sentinel Hill itself. It was the piping of unnumbered whippoorwills. In their shrill chorus they seemed like a note, a tense and evil expectancy. Earl Sawyer now took the telescope and reported the 3 figures as standing on the topmost ridge, virtually level with the altar stone, but at a considerable distance from it. One figure, he said, seemed to be raising its hands above its head in rhythmic intervals, and as Sawyer mentioned the circumstance, the crowd seemed to hear a faint, half-musical sound from a distance, as if a loud chant were accompanying the gestures. The weird silhouette in that remote peak must have been a spectacle of infinite grotesqueness and impressiveness, but no observer was in a mood for aesthetic appreciation. "I guess he's saying a spell," whispered Wheeler as he snatched back the telescope. The whippoorwills were piping wildly in a singularly curious, irregular rhythm, quite unlike that of the visible ritual. Suddenly the sunshine seemed to lessen without the intervention of any discernible cloud. It was a very peculiar phenomenon and was plainly marked by all. A rumbling sound seemed brewing beneath the hills, mixed strangely with the concordant rumbling which clearly came from the sky. Lightning flashed aloft, and the wondering crowd looked in vain for portents of the storm. The chanting of the men from Arkham now became unmistakable, and Wheeler saw through the glass that they were all raising their arms in rhythmic incantation. From some farmhouse far away came the frantic barking of dogs. The change in the quality of the daylight increased, and the crowd gazed about the horizon in wonder. A purplish darkness, born of nothing more than a spectral deepening of the sky's blue, pressed down upon the rumbling hills. Then the lightning flashed again, somewhat brighter than before, and the crowd fancied that it had showed a certain mistiness around the altar stone of the distant height. No one, however, had been using the telescope at that instant. The whippoorwills continued their irregular pulsation, and the men of Dunwich braced themselves tensely against some imponderable menace with which the atmosphere seemed surcharged. Without warning came those deep, cracked, raucous, vocal sounds which will never leave the memory of the stricken group who heard them. Not from any human throat they were born, for the organs of men can yield no such acoustic perversions. Rather, one would have said they came from the pit itself, had not their source been so unmistakably the altar stone on the peak. It almost erroneous to call them sounds at all, so much their ghastly, infrabraced timbre spoke to the dim seats of consciousness in terror far subtler than the ear. Yet one must do so, since their form was indisputably, though vaguely, that of a half-articulate words. They were loud as the rumblings and the thunder above which they echoed, yet they did not come from no visible being, and because imagination might suggest a conjectural source of the world's non-visible beings. The huddled crowd at the mountain's base still huddled closer and winced as if expectation of a blow. Yog-Sothoth, Naga, Yog-Sothoth, rang the hideous croaking out of space. Yumnich, Ithai, Ngrakle. The speaking impulse seemed to falter here, as if some frightful psychic struggle were going on. Henry Wheeler straightened his eye on the telescope, but saw only 3 grotesquely silhouetted human figures on the peak, all moving their arms furiously, and strange gestures of the incantation grew nearer its culmination. From what black wells of achrontic fear of feeling, from what unplumbed gulfs of extra-cosmic consciousness of obscure, long-latent heredity were those half-articulate thunder-croakings drawn. Presently they began to gather renewed force and coherence as they grew in stark, utter, and ultimate frenzy. Yeah, yeah, nigga, nigga, yeah, help, father, Yog-Sothoth. But that was all. The pallid group in the road, still reeling at the indisputably English syllables that had poured thickly and thunderously down the frantic vacancy beside the shocking altar stone, were never to hear such syllables again. Instead, they jumped violently at the terrific report which seemed to rend the hills, the deafening cataclysmic peal whose source, be it in earth or sky, no hero was ever able to place. A single lightning bolt shot from the purple zenith to the altar stone, and a great tidal wave of viewless force and indescribable stench swept down from the hill to all the countryside. Trees, grass, and underbrush were whipped into a fury, and the frightened crowd at the mountain's base, weakened by the lethal fetter that seemed about to asphyxiate them, were almost hurled off their feet. Dogs howled from the distance, green grass and foliage wilted to a curious sickly yellow-gray, and over field and forest were scattered the bodies of dead whippoorwills. The stench left quickly, but the vegetation never came right again. To this day there is something queer and unholy about the growths on and around that fearsome hill. Curtis Whateley was only just regaining consciousness when the arc of men came slowly down the mountain, and the beams of sunlight once more brilliant and untainted. They were grave and quiet, and seemed shaken by memories and reflections even more terrible than those which had reduced the group of natives to a state of cowed and quivering. In reply to a jumble of questions, they only shook their heads and reaffirmed one vital fact. "That thing is gone forever," Armitage said. "It has been split up into what was originally made of, and can never exist again. It was an impossibility in a normal world, only the least fraction of what really matter, in any sense we know. It was like its father, and most of it has gone back to him in some vague realm of dimension outside our material universe, some vague abyss out of which only the most accursed rites of human blasphemy could ever have called him for a moment on the hills." There was a brief silence, and in that pause the scattered senses of poor Curtis Whateley began to knit back into a sort of continuity, so he put his hands to his head with a moan. Memory seemed to pick back up itself where it had left off, and the horror on the side that had prostrated him burst in upon him again. "Oh, my God, that half-face on top of it. The face with the red eyes and the crinkly albino hair and no chin. Like a Whateley's. It was an octopus, centipede, spider kind of thing. But they was half-shaped man's face on top of it, and it looked like Wizard Whateley's, only it was yards and yards across." He paused, exhausted, as the whole group of natives stared in bewilderment, not quite crystallized into fresh terror. Only old Zebulon Whateley, who wanderingly remembered ancient things, but who had been silent heretofore, spoke aloud. 15 year gone," he rambled. "I heerd old Whateley says how some day we'd hear a child of Lavinia's calling his father's name on top of Sentinel Hill." But Joe Osborne interrupted him to question the Arkham men knew. "What was it, anyhow? And however did young Wizard Whateley call it out of the air it came from?" Armitage chose his words very carefully. It was mostly a kind of force that doesn't belong in our part of space. A kind of force that acts and grows and shapes itself by other laws than those of our sort of nature. We have no business calling in such things from outside, and only very wicked people and very wicked cults ever try to. There was some of it in Wilbur Whateley himself, enough to make a devil and a precocious monster of him, and to make his passing out a pretty terrible sight. I'm going to burn his accursed diary, and if you men are wise, you'll dynamite that altar stone up there and pull down all the rings of standing stones on the other hills. Things like that brought down the beings those Whateleys were so fond of, the beings that they were going to let in to tangibly wipe out the human race and drag the earth off to some nameless place for some nameless purpose. But as to the thing we've just sent back, the Whateleys raised it for a terrible part in the doings that were to come. It grew fast and big for the same reason that Wilbur grew fast and big. But it beat him, and because it had a greater share of the outsideness in it. You needn't ask how Wilbur called it out of the air. He didn't call it out. It was his twin brother, but it looked more like the father than he did. And that is the end of the Dunwich Horror. I appreciate you coming along with me on this journey. We have learned a great deal about the Dunwich Horror, the story, and about the story of Wilbur Whately and Dr. Armitage, both of which were gravely misconstrued by the cinematic attempts at telling this story. But we're not quite done here yet, my faithful friends. As I said, we will be reading more of this Lovecraftian fiction. There are some other great stories in here, and I believe we will continue to read these. But I have a special treat for you as part of my Halloween special. I will be playing the board game Arkham Horror, in which we will come face to face with the Dunwich Horror itself and see if we could succeed where Doctors Armitage, Rice, and Morgan succeeded in the story. We will see you then. Thank you for listening.